Maurice Lloyd Hall, for the murder of Harry Pitman, I sentence you to detention at His Majesty's pleasure. Taking account of all of the relevant circumstances and the aggravating and mitigating factors that I've set out, the minimum term will be 16 years, minus 675 days to take account of time spent on remand. This results in a sentence of 14 years and 56 days.
A severe sentence has now been handed down to the individual responsible for a tragic incident on New Year's Eve. The offender must serve a minimum term of 16 years, after accounting for 675 days already spent in custody. However, the figure stated in the sentence is only the end of the story. What has prompted wider public attention is a deeper question. How did this tragedy come to pass? How did a single act of violence in a crowded public space unfold? And how did investigators piece together the evidence that ultimately brought the case before the court? But to understand how it came to this, we need to go back. We need to return to 31 December 2023. London was preparing for the final night of the year. Streets were busy, transport was crowded, and the city's energy was building towards midnight. Across the capital, people were heading to familiar vantage points to watch the fireworks and count down together. One of those places was Primrose Hill. And on that night, in the space of just a few moments, everything changed. On the evening of 31st December 2023, Harry Pitman, aged 16, traveled to Primrose Hill with friends. It was New Year's Eve, the kind of night that for many teenagers feels like a milestone, a chance to stay out late, to be part of the city's atmosphere, and to count down to midnight surrounded by noise, lights, and excitement. Harry was one of thousands who made their way there for the same reason: to watch the fireworks and welcome in the new year with the people around him. Elsewhere on the hill was Maurice Lloyd Hall, also 16 at the time. He too had come to Primrose Hill that night, moving through the same public space and blending into the crowd. In a place filled with people, no one stood out. It was simply a mass of strangers and friendship groups standing side by side, all sharing the same view and waiting for the same moment. Primrose Hill is one of North London's most well-known viewpoints. Open, elevated, and overlooking the skyline, it attracts large crowds on major nights, and New Year's Eve is one of the busiest of all. As the evening went on, the hill became more congested. The pathways narrowed, the open areas filled, and moving through the crowd became slow and difficult. People stood close together along the grass and the paths, many holding phones in the air, talking over one another and trying to find a clear view. There was little space to step aside, and very little room between different groups. In conditions like that, contact between strangers was almost unavoidable. A shoulder brushing past, someone turning too quickly, a foot stepping into another person's space. As midnight approached, the atmosphere felt louder and tighter. The anticipation was building, and the crowd's attention was fixed on the countdown. But in the middle of all that energy and noise, it only took a brief moment for the night to shift in a different direction. And this was the setting in which the night unfolded. As the evening moved closer to midnight, the crowd on Primrose Hill became even tighter. People shifted constantly, trying to hold their place, stay with friends, and keep sight of the skyline. In a space that crowded, movement was never smooth. Everyone was forced to share the same narrow paths and the same small pockets of open ground. In the middle of that atmosphere, Harry Pitman was with his friends, laughing and play-fighting in the way teenagers often do, light, careless, and without any sense of danger. But in a packed crowd, even harmless behavior can have unintended consequences. During that play-fighting, Harry accidentally bumped into another teenager nearby. It was the kind of contact that would normally pass without a second thought. But that night, in that moment, the reaction was immediate. The teenager he had bumped into became angry, and a few sharp words were exchanged. The argument escalated quickly, What started as irritation turned into a confrontation, drawing in others who were standing close by. In a space where there was no room to step back, tension didn't have anywhere to go. It stayed between them, building with every second. Voices rose. People turned to look. A small group tightened into a circle, and the crowd around them shifted to make space, but only slightly. There wasn't enough distance to calm things down, and there wasn't enough time for the moment to dissolve on its own. The confrontation turned physical. It happened fast, not as a long fight, but as a sudden escalation that took the people nearest to it by surprise. In that confusion, Aris Lloyd Hall, who was also 16 at the time, was carrying a knife, and during the conflict, it was used. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Harry Pitman was critically injured, and the tone of the entire hill changed in a matter of seconds. The excitement that had been building towards midnight disappeared. In its place came confusion, then fear, spreading outward through the crowd as people began to realize something serious had happened. Around them, reactions were instinctive. Some stepped back, trying to get away from the center of the disturbance. Others froze, unable to process what they had just seen. Voices overlapped, people shouted, and several began calling out for help. Friends tried to find each other in the noise, while strangers moved quickly to create space and avoid being caught up in the chaos. And as the reality of the moment settled in, Primrose Hill stopped feeling like a place of celebration. It became something else entirely, a crowded public space marked by panic, shock, and a sudden sense that the night had taken a turn no one could undo. Calls for help came almost immediately. The energy on Primrose Hill shifted in seconds, from celebration and anticipation to confusion and alarm. People closest to the disturbance instinctively moved back, trying to create space, while others turned in shock, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Voices overlapped across the crowd, some shouting for help, some calling out names, others trying to reach friends through the noise and movement. Police officers were already in the area that night due to the size of the New Year's Eve gathering. As the situation unfolded, it quickly became clear to them that this was not a minor dispute or a brief confrontation that would fade away. Someone had been seriously injured, and urgent medical assistance was needed. But in those first moments, there were still many things that were not yet clear. Who was responsible? What had led to the confrontation? And exactly how events had escalated so quickly in the middle of such a crowded public space. In the minutes after the disturbance, the first priority for officers on Primrose Hill was immediate response. They moved towards the center of the crowd, assessed what had happened, and called for urgent medical assistance. In a setting as crowded as this, creating space was essential, not only to reach the injured person, but to allow paramedics to get in quickly and work without obstruction. People nearby were told to step back. Friends and strangers alike tried to make room, while others remained frozen in shock, still processing how fast the situation had escalated. The focus in those first moments was not on asking questions or collecting details. It was on getting help to the right place, as quickly as possible. As emergency services arrived, medical treatment began at the scene. But while that was happening, officers also had to manage the environment around them. Primrose Hill was still filled with people, many of whom had not seen what happened and did not yet understand why the mood had shifted so suddenly. Some were trying to leave, others were pushing forward, and rumors began to spread through the crowd. Only after the immediate emergency response was underway could the second stage begin, understanding what had taken place. The initial picture was unclear. The incident had unfolded in a tight, noisy space, with limited visibility and constant movement. People had seen different parts of it, and not everyone's account matched. Investigators therefore started with the fundamentals. They identified those who had been closest to the confrontation, took names and contact details, and began collecting early descriptions while memories were still fresh. They also started tracing available footage, including phone recordings from the crowd and camera coverage of routes to and from the hill, to build a timeline that could be checked from more than one angle. As these details were compared and cross-referenced, the investigation began to narrow its focus. From a crowd of thousands, police worked to identify the key individuals involved and to establish who had been responsible for what happened that night. In the days that followed, the investigation began to narrow. From a crowd of thousands, officers worked to identify the individual at the center of what had happened on the hill. And then, 4 days later, a key moment arrived. On the 4th of January 2024, Harry Lloyd Hall walked into Hammersmith Police Station with his father. It was not an arrest carried out on a street corner or after a dramatic chase. Instead, it happened in a quiet, controlled setting, the moment he entered the station. From there, the case moved into the formal criminal justice process. He was taken into custody, questioned, and the investigation continued under the procedures reserved for the most serious offenses. What had begun as a chaotic incident in a crowded public space was now moving into the structured world of charging decisions, court hearings, and eventually a trial where the events of that night would be examined in detail. The case did not reach a final conclusion the first time it went to court. The initial trial ended without a definitive outcome, meaning the legal process could not be closed at that stage. As a result, the case returned to court for a second time, a retrial. This meant the events of that night were examined again, and a new jury was required to reach a verdict based on the evidence and arguments presented. It was at the retrial that the case finally reached its turning point. The jury returned a guilty verdict, finding Harry Lloyd Hall guilty of murder, as well as possession of an offensive weapon. Only after that verdict was delivered could the court move to sentencing. Lloyd Hall was then given a minimum term of 16 years, with 675 days already spent in custody taken into account. To understand why this case ended with such a severe outcome, it helps to look at the legal framework the court applied. In England and Wales, murder is the most serious criminal offence. In simple terms, it involves unlawfully causing a person's death with the required intent under the law. That intent does not always mean a planned killing. In many cases, it can involve an intention to cause really serious harm, where the result is fatal. It is the reason murder carries the heaviest penalties in the system. This case also involved a legal reality that often surprises people. The defendant was 16 at the time of the incident. In situations like this, the court does not sentence a teenager in exactly the same way as an adult. Instead, the sentence is commonly expressed as detention at His Majesty's pleasure, a youth equivalent of a life sentence, where the offender can be held in custody for as long as the state considers necessary for public protection. A key part of that sentence is the minimum term. In this case, the court set a minimum term of 16 years. That does not mean release after 16 years. It means the earliest point at which release can even be considered. The court also took into account 675 days already spent in custody. This is known as credit for time served, ensuring the minimum term reflects the time already spent detained before sentencing. In the end, the story returns to where it began, a courtroom, and a sentence that brought the legal process to a close. But outside that courtroom, the consequences remain far wider than any number written on paper. What happened on Primrose Hill shows how quickly a crowded public night can shift from celebration to crisis in the space of moments. There is no dramatic lesson here, only a simple reality. When tempers rise and control is lost, the outcome can shape lives permanently. And once that line is crossed, there is no way back.